What's the biggest corporate cover-up you've heard about? Story 1. In the 1990s, the major American telecommunications companies, including the regional Bell operating companies that had inherited the AT&T monopoly infrastructure, negotiated regulatory agreements with state governments under which they would receive significant financial benefits in exchange for commitments to deploy high-speed fiber optic infrastructure to a specific percentage of American homes by specific dates. The benefits came in various forms: rate increases permitted by state regulators, tax breaks, and in some cases direct subsidies. The commitments were written into regulatory frameworks as enforceable obligations. Researcher and telecom policy analyst Bruce Kushnick has estimated the total value of these benefits, including permitted rate increases, at approximately $200 billion over the relevant period. The fiber optic deployment commitments were, across most of the country, not met. The states that had negotiated these agreements largely did not impose the penalties their own regulatory frameworks specified for non-compliance. A regulatory failure that critics attribute to the intense lobbying influence telecom companies maintained over the state public utility commissions that would have enforced the requirements. The result is the American broadband infrastructure that exists today, a market characterized by limited competition in most areas, prices significantly higher than comparable economies, and rural and lower-income communities with substantially worse access than the infrastructure that was promised and paid for would have provided. No company executive was charged with fraud. No significant public accounting of the unmet commitments was conducted at the federal level. The money, however the total is calculated, went to companies that did not deliver what they were paid to deliver, and the regulatory apparatus that should have enforced the contracts didn't. The American internet user pays for this outcome every month in their broadband bill. Story 2. In April 2016, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists published the Panama Papers, 11.5 million documents from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca, exposing the offshore financial structures used by politicians, executives, celebrities, and royalty across dozens of countries. The scale was genuinely unprecedented, the largest document leak in journalistic history to that point, documenting in specific detail how enormous quantities of wealth were being held and moved through shell companies and nominee structures in ways that ranged from legal tax avoidance to probable criminal evasion. The immediate political consequences were real and swift in specific cases. Iceland's prime minister resigned within 2 days, felled by his personal exposure in the documents. Pakistan's Supreme Court eventually removed Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif from office partly based on Panama Papers revelations. Some investigations and prosecutions followed in various countries. The structural consequence, the thing the person asking this question is pointing at, is the gap between the scale of the exposure and the scale of the reform. The offshore financial architecture the papers documented, the network of jurisdictions specifically structured to enable opaque wealth holding, the professional infrastructure of lawyers and company formation agents who facilitate it, the specific products and services that allow large sums to be held without public knowledge. This architecture remains substantially intact and operational. Subsequent leaks, including the Paradise Papers in 2017 and the Pandora Papers in 2021, have exposed the same people using the same structures, confirming that the practices documented in 2016 continued after the exposure. The firm that was exposed closed. The industry it served continues. The specific individuals most prominently named continue in most cases in their positions, or in equivalent ones. The documents change journalism's understanding of how global wealth hides. They change the underlying behavior considerably less. Story 3, the 2017 Equifax breach, deserves to be remembered with considerably more sustained anger than it typically receives. And the reason it's worth revisiting specifically is what makes it categorically different from most corporate data breaches. The data Equifax exposed wasn't data people had chosen to give Equifax. It was data Equifax had collected automatically from credit histories and financial records as part of operating as a consumer credit reporting bureau, a business model that requires no individual opt-in and provides no practical opt-out. 147 million Americans had their Social Security numbers, birth dates, addresses, credit history, and other financial information exposed because Equifax failed to patch a publicly known security vulnerability in the Apache Struts software framework for approximately 2 months after the patch was available. The vulnerability was documented. The fix was free. Equifax didn't apply it. Attackers used the vulnerability to extract data over a period of approximately 76 days before detection. 3 Equifax executives sold company stock in the days after the breach was discovered internally and before it was disclosed publicly, transactions that produced in SEC investigation. The CEO who presided over the breach, Richard Smith, retired with a compensation package estimated at approximately $90 million. The Federal Trade Commission settlement required Equifax to pay up to $700 million, including a $300 million consumer claims fund, which, when more claimants filed than the fund could support, reduced the promised $125 per person to a few dollars per person. Equifax continues operating as a credit bureau. The 3 credit reporting agencies continue collecting comprehensive financial data on essentially every American adult. The business model that created the breach, holding sensitive data on people who have no relationship with you and no ability to opt out, remains unchanged. Story 4: The Great American Streetcar Scandal, sometimes called the GM Streetcar Conspiracy, refers to a documented antitrust conspiracy in which National City Lines, a holding company that acquired and dismantled electric streetcar systems across American cities, was controlled by a combination of investors including General Motors, Standard Oil of California, Firestone Tire, and Mack Trucks. National City Lines purchased streetcar systems in dozens of cities, converted them to bus routes, and in many cases eliminated the systems entirely. In 1949, a federal jury found GM, Standard Oil, Firestone, and other defendants guilty of criminal conspiracy to monopolize the sale of buses and related products to local transit systems, a narrower antitrust charge than the broader destroying public transit to force car dependency claim that has become the popular version of this story. The fine was $5,000 per corporation and $1 for the individual convicted, a figure that modern observers correctly note was an almost entirely symbolic penalty relative to the scale of the business involved. What the conviction confirmed: a conspiracy existed between automotive and oil industry interests to acquire and control local transit markets in ways that benefited those industries. What it didn't resolve: the broader question of how much American cities' subsequent car-dependent development patterns were a result of this specific conspiracy versus other factors, including genuine consumer preference, post-war suburban development patterns, federal highway investment, and the economic challenges facing electric streetcar systems in the post-war period. Both things can be true simultaneously. The conspiracy was real and confirmed, and the degree to which it single-handedly caused America's specific urban form is contested among urban historians. The fine of $5,000 is not contested. It was $5,000. Story 5: The Exxon Valdez oil spill on March 24, 1989, released approximately 11 million gallons of crude oil into Prince William Sound, Alaska, causing what was at the time the largest oil spill in American waters and producing ecological damage to one of the most productive marine ecosystems in the world. The immediate harm was documented and severe. Hundreds of thousands of seabirds, thousands of sea otters, hundreds of harbor seals, and vast quantities of fish and shellfish, along with the communities and fishing economies that depended on them. The subsequent legal history is what this entry is pointing toward. A jury awarded $5 billion in punitive damages to Alaskan communities, fishermen, and others harmed by the spill, a figure that, in 1994, represented a serious consequence proportionate to the harm. Exxon immediately appealed and began a legal process that continued for 19 years. The final Supreme Court decision in 2008 reduced the punitive damages to approximately $507 million. Over those 19 years, Exxon did not sit idle with the money it owed. It invested the funds subject to the damages award, earning interest throughout the appeal period. The interest earned on money that should have been paid to harmed parties substantially exceeded, by various calculations, the reduction in damages that the appeal ultimately achieved. The legal delay was financially profitable for Exxon in direct mathematical terms, independent of the reputational and operational questions involved. The people waiting for compensation, many of them Alaskan fishermen whose livelihoods had been destroyed by the spill, aged through nearly 2 decades of litigation. Some died before receiving anything. The ecosystem partially recovered, though scientists document persistent effects in certain species populations decades after the spill. The company that caused it generated positive returns on the money it owed. Story 6: Tetrethyl lead, the compound added to gasoline to prevent engine knock from the 1920s onward, is one of the most consequential and most deliberately concealed public health catastrophes in American industrial history. The story of how it came to be in the fuel supply, what was known about its toxicity, and how that knowledge was suppressed for decades by the companies that profited from it, is now extensively documented, primarily through the research of environmental health scientist Claire Patterson and subsequent historical scholarship. The acute toxicity of lead was not unknown when tetrethyl lead was introduced commercially. Workers at the production facilities operated by the Standard Oil General Motors joint venture, called the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation, suffered acute lead poisoning in the early 1920s, with documented cases of psychosis, seizures, and death among production workers at facilities in New Jersey and Ohio. The Standard Oil plant was nicknamed the House of Butterflies by workers because of the hallucinations those poisoned experienced. The corporate response to these deaths was deliberate and documented, rebranding the additive as ethyl rather than by any name containing the word lead or tetrethyl lead, commissioning and publicizing studies friendly to the product's safety while suppressing internal data indicating harm, and characterizing critics as alarmists whose concerns were without scientific basis. The Public Health Service conducted a hasty study in 1926 that found insufficient evidence of immediate public harm. A study conducted on a short timeline using methods that couldn't detect the chronic, lower-level effects that would prove to be the major long-term public health issue. Lead remained in American gasoline until 1986. The resulting blood lead levels in the American population during the decades of leaded gasoline use are documented in the epidemiological record, with research linking the lead exposure of the mid-20th century to measurable population-level effects on cognitive development and other health outcomes. Story 8: Chiquita paid a terrorist organization to protect its banana plantations for nearly a decade. Chiquita Brands International, the banana company, pleaded guilty in March 2007 to making payments to the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, known by its Spanish acronym AUK, an organization the United States government had designated a foreign terrorist organization in 2001. Chiquita paid approximately $1.7 million to the AUK between 1997 and 2004, making payments that the company initially characterized as extortion, but which prosecutors documented were substantially voluntary protection payments to keep the AUK from interfering with banana plantation operations in regions where the paramilitary organization controlled territory. The AUK was responsible during the period of Chiquita's payments for documented massacres of civilians, forced displacements of communities, systematic murder of trade unionists and labor organizers, and a pattern of violence against Colombian civilians that human rights organizations characterized as among the most severe in the Western Hemisphere at the time. The specific relationship between corporate payments and paramilitary capability is a genuine causal question. The money Chiquita paid supported an organization that was simultaneously committing these acts. Chiquita's fine for pleading guilty was $25 million. No individual Chiquita executive was criminally charged. the company continued operations. Colombian families of Auk massacre victims subsequently sued Chiquita in American federal courts under the Alien Tort Statute, arguing that the payments constituted knowing support for the specific violence the Auk committed. These cases proceeded through years of litigation. The $25 million fine was paid. The $7 million that had flowed to a terrorist organization whose members carried out documented massacres was never characterized by the company as anything other than a regrettable business necessity in a difficult operating environment. Story 9: TEPCO falsified nuclear safety records more than 200 times before Fukushima. The Tokyo Electric Power Company's safety record at its nuclear facilities before the March 2011 Fukushima Daiichi disaster is a documented history of systematic fraud rather than simply inadequate safety culture. And this distinction matters enormously for understanding why the disaster happened in the way it did and whether it was preventable. Beginning in 1987 and continuing through at least 2002, TEPCO employees and contractors falsified inspection records at the company's nuclear facilities in ways that are specific, documented, and were eventually confirmed by the company itself. The falsifications included fabricating data on reactor shroud cracks, structural components whose integrity is critical to reactor safety, where the actual condition of the equipment was documented as defective in internal records, while the records submitted to regulators showed acceptable condition. The Japan Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency found approximately 29 cases of falsified inspection data at the Fukushima plant alone in 2002 after a whistleblower prompted an inspection. TEPCO admitted to the falsifications in 2002 and temporarily shut down reactors for re-inspection. The company's executives resigned. Regulatory oversight of the company's subsequent operations and the adequacy of those operations to address the documented cultural and procedural failures are questions that the 2011 disaster eventually answered in the most catastrophic possible way. The specific relationship between the pre-2002 falsification culture and the decisions made at Fukushima during the 2011 earthquake and tsunami is a subject of ongoing analysis. What the investigation record established is that the company responsible for one of the 3 worst nuclear accidents in history had a documented, admitted practice of falsifying safety records that preceded the accident by more than 2 decades. Story 10: Hooker Chemical buried 21,000 tons of toxic waste, sold the land for $1, and walked away. The Love Canal disaster is one of the most important environmental cases in American legal and regulatory history, because it is the specific catastrophe that directly produced the Superfund law, the legislation that created the mechanism for holding polluters financially responsible for contaminated site cleanup, and that remains the primary legal framework for addressing legacy industrial contamination in the United States. Hooker Chemical Company, later a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum, used the abandoned Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York, as a chemical waste dump from 1942 to 1952, depositing approximately 21,000 tons of chemical waste, including chlorinated pesticides, solvents, and other toxic compounds in a clay-lined trench. When Hooker sold the site to the Niagara Falls City School Board in 1953, the deed included language acknowledging the buried waste and disclaiming liability for any resulting damage. The school board built an elementary school on the site. The surrounding area was developed as a residential neighborhood. For decades, residents experienced elevated rates of specific health problems, miscarriages, birth defects, neurological issues, without connecting them to the contamination beneath their neighborhood. In the late 1970s, Love Canal resident and activist Lois Gibbs organized her community after noticing an elevated illness rate among neighborhood children and tracing it to contamination seeping through basement walls and into yards. The resulting investigation, media coverage, and federal response, which eventually involved relocating approximately 800 families and declaring Love Canal the first federal environmental emergency, produced the 1980 Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. Hooker Chemicals' liability was contested in litigation that continued for years. The $1 sale price and the liability waiver included in the deed became specific exhibits in how the company's legal team attempted to limit its responsibility for what the chemical waste had done to the families living above it. Story 11, the 1952 London smog killed 12,000 people, and industry spent years blaming the weather. The Great Smog of London in December 1952 is covered elsewhere in this collection as a historical event, but its specific corporate and institutional cover-up dimension deserves direct treatment. The smog killed approximately 4,000 people immediately, and an estimated 8,000 more in the following weeks from respiratory and cardiovascular conditions aggravated by the pollution, making it one of the most deadly air pollution events in Western European history. The political and commercial response to the deaths was not initially a serious accounting of what had caused them. The government of Winston Churchill, resistant to the suggestion that action on air pollution was urgently needed, downplayed the death toll. The Ministry of Health initially attributed the excess deaths primarily to the concurrent influenza epidemic, a framing that required significant statistical creativity given the available data. The transit and coal industries specifically. This entry notes, funded and promoted messaging attributing the smog's effects to unusual weather, the temperature inversion that trapped the pollution near the ground, rather than to the pollution itself. This framing had the effect of presenting the disaster as an unforeseeable meteorological event, rather than the predictable consequence of the specific fuels being burned in the specific quantity they were being burned in London in 1952. The campaign to attribute the deaths to weather rather than pollution delayed meaningful legislative response. The Clean Air Act that eventually addressed the underlying coal-burning problem was not passed until 1956, 4 years after the disaster. During those 4 years, London experienced several additional smaller smog events that continued to harm public health. The industry funded unusual weather framing, did real work in buying time, and it cost lives. Story 12, Chiso Corporation blamed malnutrition for a mercury poisoning epidemic it had created. Minamata disease is one of the most severe industrial pollution disasters in modern history and one of the most thoroughly documented cases of corporate knowledge concealment, contributing directly to mass preventable suffering. The Chiso Corporation chemical plant in Minamata, Japan began discharging mercury-contaminated wastewater into Minamata Bay in the 1930s, and by the 1950s, residents of communities around the bay were experiencing a neurological syndrome of unknown cause, loss of motor control, sensory disturbances, vision and hearing loss, tremors, and in severe cases, madness and death. The disease affected not only humans, but the cats of the fishing communities around the bay, who ate contaminated fish and began exhibiting the same symptoms, dancing uncontrollably and throwing themselves into the sea, behavior so consistent it gave the disease one of its early informal names. Birds fell from the sky. Shellfish behaved abnormally. The entire aquatic food chain in the bay showed signs of a systemic toxin. Chiso's internal research in the late 1950s identified methylmercury as the cause and confirmed that the company's own wastewater was the source. This internal finding was concealed. The company continued discharging contaminated wastewater. Company-affiliated researchers publicly attributed the neurological syndrome to malnutrition and other causes. When an independent Kumamoto University research team identified methylmercury as the cause in 1959, Chiso's response was to challenge the findings, deploy alternative explanations, and avoid any official confirmation of the company's responsibility. The full scope of Chiso's concealment was established in subsequent decades of litigation. More than 2,000 patients were officially certified as suffering from Minamata disease. The actual number of people affected is estimated to be considerably higher. Story 13, Ford Pinto. The company did the math and decided deaths were cheaper than a fix the Ford Pinto fuel tank case is one of the most cited examples in the literature on corporate ethics, regulatory failure, and cost-benefit analysis applied to human life. And what makes it specifically useful is the document at its center, a real internal Ford cost-benefit memorandum that made explicit what corporate safety decision-making often leaves implicit. The Pinto, produced from 1971 to 1980, had a design flaw in the placement of its fuel tank, positioned behind the rear axle. The tank was vulnerable to rupture and fire in rear-end collisions at relatively low speeds. Ford engineers were aware of this vulnerability during development and during production. A fix, repositioning the tank or adding a protective baffle, was technically feasible at an estimated cost of approximately $11 per vehicle. An internal Ford memorandum, which became an exhibit in subsequent litigation and was eventually published publicly, conducted a cost-benefit analysis comparing the cost of the $11 modification across all Pinto vehicles against the estimated cost of liability from deaths and injuries. The analysis used the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's own figure for the statistical value of a human life and calculated that the total liability cost of the projected deaths and injuries was lower than the cost of the modification. The conclusion was to not implement the fix. This calculation, explicit, documented, put in writing, became the central exhibit in a case that produced a $128 million punitive damages award and a larger cultural reckoning with what it means for a corporation to explicitly calculate that the lives it expects its product to take are worth less than the cost of preventing those deaths. The 27 deaths and numerous injuries attributed to the Pinto's fuel tank design were not an accident in the sense of being unpredictable. They were projected, valued, and judged acceptable. Story 14: GM knew its ignition switches were killing people for over a decade before recalling them. The General Motors ignition switch defect is one of the most extensively documented cases of a corporation tracking deaths caused by a known product defect while concealing that defect from regulators and the public. The specific defect, an ignition switch in numerous GM vehicles, including the Chevrolet Cobalt and Saturn Ion, that could slip from the run position to accessory while driving, cutting power to the engine, power steering, and critically, the airbags, was documented in GM's internal engineering systems from at least 2001. Between 2001 and the 2014 recall, GM engineers tracked and documented crashes and deaths connected to the defect. Internal documents showed that engineers understood the relationship between the switch failure and airbag non-deployment, understood that airbag non-deployment in crashes that should have triggered them was connected to the switch position, and tracked the resulting fatalities in internal databases. Product reviews noted the problem. Solutions were considered and rejected in at least one documented case because a proposed fix would have required changing the part number, triggering formal documentation requirements that would create a paper trail acknowledging the defect. The GM recall of 2.6 million vehicles in 2014 came after investigative reporting by CNN and other outlets connected the crash pattern to the ignition switch. The subsequent congressional investigation and Department of Justice investigation documented the internal knowledge trail in detail. GM paid a $900 million settlement to the Department of Justice and established a compensation fund for victims. At least 124 deaths were officially attributed to the defect by the time of the settlement, a figure many families of victims considered significantly understated. The specific detail that has stayed in the cultural memory, that changing a part number to document a fix, was understood internally to create more legal exposure than leaving the defect in place and accepting the resulting deaths. Story 15: Firestone tires were shredding at highway speed. They quietly fixed it abroad and said nothing in America. The Firestone tire crisis of 2000, involving ADEX and Wilderness at tires fitted primarily on Ford Explorer SUVs, produced one of the most thoroughly documented cases of a company quietly addressing a known safety problem in markets where regulatory and liability consequences were more immediate while delaying action in the American market. The specific defect, certain Firestone tires, under conditions including high ambient temperatures and highway speeds, were prone to tread separation, the tread layer peeling away from the tire body while the vehicle was in motion. On an SUV with a high center of gravity like the Ford Explorer, sudden tread separation at highway speed could produce loss of control and rollover. The tire failure was implicated in hundreds of crashes and approximately 271 deaths, the majority of them in the United States. Firestone and Ford had data showing elevated complaint and warranty claim rates for these specific tire models from the mid-1990s. In 1999, Ford conducted a tire replacement program in Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and other markets where the high-temperature conditions accelerating tread separation were most prevalent. This replacement used company funds and was conducted quietly, without notification to NHTSA or to Ford Explorer owners in the United States, whose tires were the same product. The concealment of the International Replacement Program from American regulators was what converted a serious safety failure into a cover-up. When the American crisis broke in 2000, triggered by investigative reporting that obtained the ENSA complaint data and connected it to the tire model, the existence of the international program became the central evidence that both companies had known about the problem and had not disclosed it. The resulting recall covered 6.5 million tires. Story 16: Takata's airbags were turning into shrapnel bombs. They falsified data to hide it. The Takata airbag crisis is the largest automotive recall in history, ultimately covering more than 100 million vehicles across multiple manufacturers globally. And at its center is a documented, sustained program of safety data falsification by a company that had discovered its product could kill the people it was designed to protect. The defect: Takata's airbag inflators used ammonium nitrate as the explosive propellant that inflates the airbag on impact. Ammonium nitrate is a highly effective propellant, but is also known to absorb moisture and to become unstable over time, particularly in hot and humid climates. As the inflators aged, the degraded ammonium nitrate could produce a pressure wave significantly more powerful than designed, causing the metal inflator canister to rupture and project metal fragments into the vehicle's interior. The airbag safety device had become a fragmentation device. Internal Takata testing, beginning in the mid-2000s, identified the instability problem. Safety engineers documented the failure mode and its conditions. The corporate response was to falsify and alter the test data before submitting it to automotive manufacturers and regulators, presenting the inflators as meeting safety specifications when internal testing showed they did not. The consequences of this falsification, as vehicles with degraded inflators remained in service, continued to be sold and accumulated the mileage and climate exposure that produced the rupture conditions, were deaths. By the time the full scale of the recall was underway, at least 27 deaths and more than 400 injuries in the United States alone had been attributed to inflator ruptures. Takata filed for bankruptcy in 2017, with liabilities exceeding $10 billion. The falsification of safety test data by engineers who understood what the untreated inflators would do is the specific fact that makes this a cover-up rather than simply a product failure. Story 17: The White Star Olympic Titanic Swap. The insurance fraud theory that evidence doesn't support the theory that the White Star Line swapped the identities of the ARMS Olympic and RM's Titanic, passing the already damaged Olympic off as the Titanic for insurance purposes and intentionally sinking it is one of the more persistently circulated Titanic alternative histories, and it deserves honest treatment both because it's widely believed and because the available evidence does not support it. The basic premise rests on a real event. The ARMS Olympic was damaged in a collision with Ms. Hawk in September 1911, and the repair costs created financial strain for White Star. The theory then proposes that White Star secretly renamed the two ships, intending to sink the damaged Olympic and collect the insurance, but that the disaster went wrong, killing far more people than planned. The documented problems with this theory are significant and specific. The Titanic's hull number, 401, was stamped on internal components throughout the ship during construction at Harland and Wolff, in locations that would not have been accessible or economically feasible to change during a supposed name swap. When portions of the Titanic's wreck have been examined, hull number 401 has been found on recovered components. The Olympics insurance coverage was not, in fact, insufficient to make fraud economically attractive. The Titanic was insured for approximately $1 million, which was below its actual construction cost. Former Harland and Wolff workers who would have had to execute the swap never produced any account of it. The theory has been carefully examined by maritime historians and Titanic researchers who have found it inconsistent with the physical, documentary, and testimonial record. The real disaster killed 1,500 people through a combination of design choices, operational decisions, and inadequate lifeboat provision. That reality requires no conspiracy. Story 18 rayon factory workers were going blind and having strokes. Companies called it laziness. The viscose rayon industry of the early 20th century is one of the less well-known chapters of industrial occupational health concealment, and its relative obscurity, compared to cases like the radium girls or lead paint, reflects the specific populations most affected and the period's general limitations on occupational health reporting and worker advocacy. Viscose rayon is produced through a process that involves dissolving cellulose in carbon disulfide, a highly toxic solvent. Chronic exposure to carbon disulfide at the concentrations produced in poorly ventilated early rayon factories causes a specific and severe cluster of health effects: damage to the peripheral and central nervous system, psychiatric disturbances including psychosis, severe cardiovascular damage increasing the risk of strokes and heart disease, and in high enough concentrations, blindness from damage to the optic nerves. Factory workers producing rayon throughout the early decades of the industry, primarily women in poorly paid textile jobs with no health monitoring, experienced these effects. The medical literature of the period includes documentation of the specific neurological effects of carbon disulfide exposure going back to the 19th century, meaning the companies operating these factories had access to the relevant science about what their workers were breathing. The corporate response followed a recognizable pattern, attributing worker illness to individual lifestyle factors, characterizing affected workers as constitutionally weak or morally deficient, conducting no systematic health monitoring that would have revealed a pattern attributable to workplace exposure, and resisting any workplace safety modifications on the grounds of cost and the claim that the evidence of harm was insufficient. Workers who survived long enough to develop identifiable chronic conditions were often dismissed before they could claim any compensation, ensuring the cost of their occupational injuries was borne by themselves and their families. Story 19: The Radium Girls. A corporation blamed syphilis for radiation poisoning it had caused. The Radium Girls are among the most important figures in the history of occupational health and safety law in the United States, and the specific actions taken by the U.S. Radium Corporation to conceal what was happening to its workers represent one of the most thoroughly documented examples of corporate fraud in service of protecting liability exposure. Young women, many of them teenagers, were employed in dial painting factories, primarily in New Jersey, from the mid-1910s onward, to apply radium-based luminous paint to watch dials, military instrument gauges, and clock faces. They were instructed to point their brushes by putting them in their mouths to achieve a fine tip, a technique called lip pointing. They were told, when they asked about safety, that the radium was harmless, a claim the factory supervisors and management knew to be false, since their own industrial hygiene consultants had recommended measures to limit employee exposure that were not extended to the workers themselves. The specific concealment came as workers began experiencing the consequences of chronic radium ingestion, jaw necrosis, where the bone literally died and crumbled, anemia, and cancer. U.S. Radium Corporation hired a medical expert named Frederick Flynn to examine affected workers and produce findings attributing their conditions to syphilis and other causes, shielding the company from the medical conclusions that would have confirmed occupational radiation exposure as the cause. The women sued. Several of the most affected plaintiffs were too ill to attend court and had to be carried in on stretchers. The case settled in 1928, with modest payments and public acknowledgement of occupational causation. The legal precedents established through the Radium Girls lawsuits contributed directly to subsequent occupational safety legislation and established the principle that workers have the right to sue employers for occupational illness. Story 20: DuPont found C8 in their workers' children's blood and spent decades not telling anyone the story of C8. The perfluorooctanoic acid used in manufacturing Teflon and other non-stick products is one of the most extensively documented environmental cover-up cases of the late 20th century. And it has the specific quality of being driven substantially into public view by a single attorney, Robert Bilott, whose 15-year legal battle against DuPont eventually produced both a settlement and a substantial public record of what the company knew and when. DuPont began producing C8 at its Washington Works facility in Parkersburg, West Virginia in the late 1940s. By the 1980s, internal DuPont studies had identified C8 as a compound that accumulated in human tissue, crossed the placental barrier, appeared in human blood, and was present at elevated levels in the blood of workers' family members living near the facility, as well as in the drinking water of several communities drawing water from the Ohio River downstream of the plant's discharge points. The specific internal finding that has received the most attention, a DuPont study of children born to female workers at the Washington Works facility, conducted in the 1980s, documented elevated rates of birth defects. This finding was not disclosed to regulators, to the affected communities, or to the workers themselves. DuPont continued to discharge C8 into the river and into the air, while monitoring the resulting contamination of local water supplies. Bilott's lawsuit, filed in 1999 on behalf of a West Virginia farmer whose cattle were dying from exposure to C8 in the waterway, eventually expanded into a class action and produced access to DuPont's internal documents spanning decades of concealed knowledge about C8's toxicity and contamination footprint. The case and its documentation became the basis for the film Dark Waters and produced an EPA assessment that eventually led to regulatory limits on C8 and related PFAS compounds. Story 21: Fen-Phen, the diet drug company that hid reports of fatal heart damage to keep, selling it the Fen-Phen crisis of the late 1990s, is one of the clearest documented cases of a pharmaceutical company receiving evidence that its blockbuster product was causing fatal harm and systematically managing that evidence to protect revenues rather than reporting it to regulators and withdrawing the product. Fen-Phen, a combination of fenfluramine and phentermine, was an extraordinarily commercially successful weight loss treatment in the mid-1990s, prescribed to millions of patients and generating billions in revenue for its manufacturer, American Home Products. The combination's commercial success was built on clinical evidence of significant weight loss effectiveness, which was real. Beginning in the mid-1990s, reports began reaching American Home Products from physicians treating Fen-Phen patients who had developed pulmonary hypertension, a severe, progressive, and often fatal condition involving high blood pressure in the arteries supplying the lungs, and distinctive heart valve abnormalities. These reports were coming from multiple independent clinical settings, indicating a pattern rather than individual case anomalies. Internal company documents produced in subsequent litigation showed that American Home Products employees received and tracked these reports, understood their significance, and made decisions to manage the information rather than report it. The FDA was informed of some cases, but not of the developing pattern that internal tracking showed. The Mayo Clinic's 1997 publication of a case series showing heart valve abnormalities in Fen-Phen patients triggered the FDA investigation that produced the 1997 market withdrawal and voluntary recall. The subsequent litigation produced a settlement fund of approximately $3.75 billion for affected patients, and internal documents showing what the company knew and when became exhibits in years of litigation. The specific window between when the company had evidence of cardiac harm and when the drug was withdrawn is documented in those internal records. Story 22: The Hawk's Nest Tunnel. A Union Carbide contractor buried its dead workers in mass graves. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster of the late 1920s and early 1930s is one of the worst industrial disasters in American history and one of the least well-known. A disproportion that reflects both the period's limited occupational safety protections and the specific population most affected, primarily Black migrant workers from the South with limited access to legal recourse and limited capacity to generate sustained media attention. Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation contracted with a construction company to drill a tunnel through Gauley Mountain in West Virginia to divert water for a hydroelectric project. The mountain the tunnel passed through was composed almost entirely of nearly pure silica rock. Drilling through silica produces silica dust, and silica dust, when inhaled, causes silicosis, a progressive and uniformly fatal lung disease that develops over years in chronic low-level exposure and within weeks in acute high-level exposure. The rock's silica content was exceptionally high, and the dust concentration in the tunnel was extraordinary. Workers who complained of breathing difficulty were told to keep working. Supervisors wore respirators. Workers were not given them. The construction was accelerated specifically during the silica-rich sections, creating the highest possible dust exposure during the period when dust levels were most dangerous. Workers began dying within weeks and months of their tunnel exposure. The contractor, to limit liability, buried workers in mass graves with minimal documentation, ensuring that the scale of deaths would be difficult to establish and that connections between individual deaths and tunnel employment would be hard to prove in any legal proceedings. Estimates of the total death toll range from approximately 400 to over 700, with the true number uncertain, precisely because of how the deaths were managed. A 1936 congressional investigation documented the disaster and produced significant testimony about conditions in the tunnel and the company's management of the resulting deaths. Story 23, a Japanese rice oil company, kept selling PCB contaminated oil while workers developed lesions. The Yush disease outbreak of 1968 in Japan is one of the most documented mass food contamination events of the 20th century. And the specific gap between when the contamination was known to company employees and when it was reported to health authorities is what makes it a corporate cover-up, rather than simply an industrial accident. Kanemi Sko, a rice bran oil manufacturer in Fukuoka, accidentally contaminated approximately 1,800 liters of rice bran oil with polychlorinated biphenyls in February 1968, when heat transfer fluid from a heating system leaked through a fractured pipe and mixed with the oil. PCBs are chlorinated organic compounds that are highly toxic, lipid-soluble, and bioaccumulate in fatty tissues, causing a specific pattern of severe health effects including chloracte, liver damage, neurological effects, and long-term immune system disruption. The contaminated oil was distributed and sold to consumers throughout Western Japan. Reports of unusual skin conditions and illness among consumers began reaching Kanemi in April 1968. Company employees were aware of complaints and illnesses consistent with toxic exposure. The contaminated oil remained in distribution until October 1968, when the contamination was identified and reported to health authorities. A gap of months during which consumers continued purchasing and consuming the contaminated product. By the time the contamination was identified and the product recalled, more than 14,000 people had been exposed. The long-term health effects in the affected population, including elevated cancer rates and immune system effects that persisted across decades, were documented in subsequent epidemiological studies. The specific period during which the company had indications of a problem and did not remove the product from sale is the documented cover-up component of a disaster that might otherwise be characterized purely as an accident. Story 24, Nestle dress sales reps as nurses to sell baby formula to mothers who had no clean water. The Nestle infant formula marketing controversy is one of the most sustained and well-documented cases of corporate harm to vulnerable populations and its specific character. Deploying the trust associated with healthcare professionals to sell a product in conditions where its use was genuinely dangerous makes it a particularly clear example of how sophisticated marketing can be deployed in ways that cause mass harm. Beginning in the 1970s, Nestle and other infant formula manufacturers pursued aggressive marketing strategies in developing countries, targeting new mothers in contexts where breastfeeding was the standard infant feeding method. The marketing strategies included free product samples in hospitals and maternity wards, establishing formula use during the period when breastfeeding patterns are established, and when formula substitution most effectively suppresses lactation, and deploying company representatives in nursing uniforms to visit mothers at home, lending the appearance of healthcare authority to what was a commercial sales interaction. The specific harm produced by this marketing in communities without reliable access to clean water, powdered formula requires mixing with water, and when mixed with contaminated water, formula feeding exposes infants to the gastrointestinal pathogens that clean water-supplied communities take for granted their water supply doesn't carry. Infants who would have been protected by breast milk, which is sterile and carries maternal antibodies, were instead fed formula mixed with contaminated water by mothers who had been marketed into believing formula was superior to or equivalent to breastfeeding. The World Health Organization estimated in 1981 that approximately 1.5 million infant deaths annually were attributable in part to inappropriate infant formula use, a figure that reflects the global scope of aggressive marketing practices of which Nestle was the most prominent but not the only practitioner. The resulting international boycott of Nestle products, which began in 1977 and has been intermittently renewed since, is one of the longest-running consumer boycotts in commercial history. Story 25: steel mills sold radioactive slag to construction companies who used it to build houses. Slag, the byproduct of metal smelting processes, produced when impurities are separated from molten metal, has a long history of reuse in construction, where its structural properties make it genuinely useful as aggregate for road base, concrete, and foundation fill. The specific concern this entry raises is the subset of slag produced from ores that contain naturally occurring radioactive material, a category that includes certain iron ores processed by steel mills throughout the 20th century. The naturally occurring radioactive elements of most concern in this context are uranium, thorium, and their decay products, which can concentrate in slag from ores that contain them in low but elevated concentrations relative to standard background levels. When this slag is used in construction, particularly in road surfaces and building foundations, it can produce elevated radiation exposures for people living and working on the resulting structures. The specific corporate dimension of this story is the documentation, in various cases across the United States and Europe, that companies producing radioactive slag either knew or should have known about the elevated radioactivity in their byproduct and sold it to construction markets without disclosure. In some cases specifically because the alternative, treating it as radioactive waste with the associated regulatory and disposal costs, was significantly more expensive. Investigations by state regulators in various jurisdictions have identified specific construction sites, roads, and residential areas with elevated radiation levels attributable to radioactive slag. The remediation costs for confirmed contaminated sites have in several cases exceeded the economic value of the original slag sales by orders of magnitude, while the companies that sold the material have in most cases long since undergone bankruptcy or corporate transformation that limits practical liability. Story 26: chemical giants dumped mercury into the Venice Lagoon and falsified environmental audits. For decades, Porto Marghera, the industrial zone on the mainland immediately adjacent to Venice, Italy, hosted one of Europe's largest concentrations of chemical manufacturing throughout the 20th century. The Venice Lagoon, the shallow, enclosed body of water separating Venice from the mainland, one of the most ecologically and culturally significant waterways in Europe, was the discharge point for decades of industrial effluent from these facilities. Solvay and other chemical companies operating at Marghera discharged significant quantities of mercury and chlorinated organic solvents into the lagoon through a combination of direct discharge, runoff from industrial sites, and inadequately treated wastewater. The biological concentration of mercury through the lagoon's food chain was documented by researchers beginning in the 1970s, producing elevated mercury levels in the lagoon's fish and shellfish, and in the communities consuming them. The specific cover-up dimension documented in subsequent investigations and trials, which produced a major Italian criminal trial in the 1990s concerning the Marghera industrial complex, involved company knowledge of contamination levels exceeding what was being reported to environmental regulators, the falsification or selective presentation of environmental monitoring data to maintain the appearance of regulatory compliance, and active lobbying against tightening of environmental standards that would have required more substantial treatment investments. The Marghera criminal trials of the 1990s and 2000s produced findings against company executives for environmental offenses and worker harm, though the convictions and penalties were reduced substantially through appeals. The Venice Lagoon contamination from industrial discharges is a documented, ongoing environmental issue. Sediment remediation and ongoing monitoring continued decades after the primary industrial discharges were controlled. Story 27, a nuclear laundry company, dumped radioactive wastewater into city sewers and falsified employee health records. Nuclear power plants produced large quantities of contaminated protective clothing, garments, gloves, and other items worn by workers in radiation areas that accumulate radioactive contamination during normal plant operation. Specialized commercial laundries exist to clean these items, using processes that capture radioactive contamination in the wash water, treat it to reduce radioactivity, and manage the resulting concentrated waste appropriately. When these facilities operate correctly, they provide an essential service. When they don't, they convert a controlled waste stream into an uncontrolled one. The specific misconduct described in this entry, bypassing filtration systems to discharge untreated radioactive laundry wastewater directly into municipal sewer systems, creates a situation where radioactive material enters water treatment infrastructure not designed to capture or concentrate it, potentially reaching waterways, and where municipal wastewater treatment workers and downstream users are exposed without any awareness that the discharge is occurring. The falsification of employee medical records to mask radiation exposure levels is a distinct but related offense. Workers who accumulate radiation exposure above regulatory limits should be removed from radiation work until their accumulated dose declines to acceptable levels. And falsified records allow companies to avoid the operational inconvenience and liability implications of acknowledging those exposures, while workers continue accumulating dose without the protections the regulatory limits are designed to provide. Cases in this category have been identified across multiple states and prosecuted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and Department of Justice, producing criminal convictions in several confirmed instances. The combination of environmental contamination and worker health record falsification reflects an operational culture in which the costs of proper compliance were deliberately shifted onto the public and the workers themselves. Story 28, BP Alaska falsified pipeline inspection data until 200,000 gallons of oil spilled in 2006 on March 2nd, 2006. A BP-operated oil pipeline in the Prudhoe Bay oil field on Alaska's North Slope leaked approximately 200,000 gallons of crude oil onto the tundra, the largest spill in the history of the North Slope, and the catalyst for an investigation that documented years of systematic pipeline safety management failures. The pipeline that failed had been subject to internal warnings about corrosion from BP's own engineers for years before the failure. Corrosion inhibitor injection, designed to slow the internal corrosion that is a predictable challenge in oil pipelines, had been reduced as a cost-cutting measure. The practice of pigging, running diagnostic tools through the pipeline to measure wall thickness and identify corrosion, had been significantly curtailed in the Prudhoe Bay field, with transit lines going unpigged for years at a time in a field where the practice was specifically required and where corrosion conditions were known to be challenging. The investigation that followed the 2006 spill found evidence of inspection reports that did not accurately reflect the actual condition of pipeline sections creating a documented record of regulatory compliance that was disconnected from the actual physical state of the infrastructure. BP reached a criminal plea agreement in 2007 on misdemeanor charges related to the spill, paying approximately $20 million in fines and penalties, a figure that many observers noted was modest relative to the profits generated by the Prudhoe Bay field. A further significant spill from the same pipeline field occurred in August 2006, adding approximately 1,000 barrels of oil to the total release during the period of the safety management failures. Story 29, a Kawasaki bullet train ran for hours with its frame nearly cracked into the December 2017 discovery on Japan's Shinkansen bullet train network of a car running with a near-complete fracture in its steel undercarriage frame is a case that produced genuine alarm in a country whose high-speed rail system is globally recognized for its safety record. And a subsequent investigation that revealed the fracture was a symptom of deeper manufacturing quality control failures. The specific train, operated by West Japan Railway, was found during a routine inspection to have a crack extending through approximately 90% of the cross-section of a key structural component, leaving approximately 10% of the material intact. The train had been operating in passenger service for several hours with this condition. The inspection that found the crack was conducted because a crew member had noticed an unusual smell and sound during the journey. The crack itself was not detected by the scheduled inspection regime that should have identified it. The investigation into the crack's origin revealed that Kawasaki Heavy Industries, the manufacturer, had a documented pattern of producing frames with steel thickness below the specified safety standards, then falsifying the quality control records submitted with the components to show them as meeting specifications. The practice had been ongoing for years, involved multiple factory supervisors with knowledge of the falsification, and affected components delivered to multiple rail operators. Japan's culture of quality manufacturing, the concept of monozukuri, and the global reputation of Japanese manufacturing for precision and reliability made the specific character of this falsification particularly striking in domestic coverage. The falsification was not the work of uninformed workers who didn't understand the specifications. It was a deliberate management decision to meet delivery schedules by compromising on material specifications and then concealing the compromise. Story 30, Norwegian Cruise Line kept boarding new passengers onto norovirus-infected ships. Norovirus, the highly contagious pathogen responsible for most cases of what people colloquially call stomach flu, is a documented and persistent challenge for cruise ship operations, where the combination of large numbers of people in close quarters, shared surfaces and dining facilities, and the logistical complexity of sanitizing an entire vessel creates conditions in which outbreaks can spread rapidly and are difficult to fully contain. The regulatory framework for cruise ship norovirus outbreaks includes reporting requirements to the Centers for Disease Control, which operates the vessel sanitation program specifically to monitor and address shipboard illness outbreaks. When a ship has an active, confirmed norovirus outbreak, the responsible operator is expected to implement enhanced cleaning and disinfection protocols and to take steps to prevent spreading the infection to new passengers boarding for subsequent voyages. The specific cover-up described in this entry, concealing internal medical logs documenting an active outbreak while continuing to board new passengers onto inadequately sanitized vessels, represents a deliberate choice to prioritize revenue from ticket sales over the health of passengers who had no knowledge they were boarding a ship with an active contagion problem. Cruise lines have significant financial incentive to avoid canceling voyages, since cancellations require refunding ticket revenue, providing alternative accommodation, and managing the reputational damage of a publicly confirmed outbreak. Norwegian Cruise Line has faced various regulatory actions and civil litigation related to its management of illness outbreaks on vessels across its operating history. The specific pattern of concealing outbreak data from regulators and passengers is the documented misconduct element that distinguishes these cases from the ordinary challenge of managing a highly contagious pathogen on a complex vessel. Story 31. an exploding water heater defect was quietly settled away under confidentiality for years. The pattern of product liability management through confidential settlements rather than public recall is one of the most consequential and least visible mechanisms by which corporations can simultaneously acknowledge the existence of a safety problem and prevent the public from learning about it. The specific mechanism: when a defective product causes injury or death, the manufacturer faces potential litigation from the affected parties. If the manufacturer settles the case with a payment and a confidentiality agreement requiring the plaintiff not to disclose the settlement terms or the product's role in the injury, each settlement silences one potential public voice about the defect. Meanwhile, identical defective units remain in service in millions of homes, with no public notice that the product has a known failure mode. The gas control valve defect described in this entry, a valve that could stick in the open position, allowing gas to accumulate and create explosion risk, is specifically dangerous because of the location of water heaters in residential use, typically in basements or utility spaces, where gas accumulation is concentrated and an ignition source can be as mundane as a furnace cycling or a light switch. A defect that produces an explosion risk in a confined residential space is among the higher consequence product safety failures a manufacturer can face. The choice to use confidential settlements rather than a public recall preserves the manufacturer's ability to continue selling the defective product, avoids the reputational damage of a public safety notice, and shifts the mortality risk onto future purchasers and users who have no information that a problem exists. It is legal. It results in people dying from defects that manufacturers have documented evidence of. Story 32: Hoffman-LaRoche hid evidence that Accutane was causing permanent vision damage. Accutane, the brand name for isotretinoin, produced by Hoffman-LaRoche, was one of the most effective acne treatments ever developed, producing dramatic improvements in severe acne cases that had resisted all other treatment. It was also a drug with a documented and serious side effect profile that required careful monitoring and strict prescribing controls, including a program requiring pregnancy testing because of its severe teratogenicity. The specific concealment described in this entry involves ophthalmological side effects, evidence documented in internal clinical data that some Accutane users were experiencing significant visual impairment, including night blindness and permanent vision changes. The mechanism is plausible. Isotretinoin affects vitamin A metabolism, and vitamin A is essential for the function of rod cells in the retina, which mediate vision in low-light conditions. The claim that internal clinical data showing these effects was not disclosed to regulators, preventing the kind of black box warning that would have required physicians to monitor patients' vision during treatment, is consistent with a documented pattern in the pharmaceutical industry of managing adverse event reporting to protect blockbuster drug sales, a practice that has been documented in multiple high-profile pharmaceutical cases and has led to regulatory reforms in adverse event reporting requirements. Accutane has been the subject of extensive litigation across multiple adverse effect categories, and Roche faced significant liability exposure across multiple jurisdictions. The drug was voluntarily withdrawn from the U.S. market by Roche in 2009, primarily due to litigation costs, though generic isotretinoin continues to be prescribed under a strict risk management program. Story 33: a German company sold radioactive toothpaste in the 1930s and 40s while tracking cancer in users. The Doramad radioactive toothpaste case occupies a specific historical context that makes it different from most corporate health cover-ups. It occurred during the era when radioactivity was being actively marketed as a health benefit, when the specific risks of radioactive element incorporation into biological tissue were understood in the research community but had not been communicated to the public or fully accepted by regulators, and when the Nazi-era German regulatory environment provided limited constraint on health product marketing claims. The Doramad toothpaste, produced by Auergesellschaft, contained thorium as its active ingredient and was marketed with claims that the radioactivity strengthened tooth enamel, killed bacteria, and promoted oral health. The The toothpaste was sold commercially throughout Germany and occupied territories in the 1930s and 1940s. The specific claim in this entry, that internal researchers identifying a pattern of oral cancers and bone necrosis in regular users was concealed while marketing continued, reflects a well-documented pattern in the broader radium product industry of the period, where manufacturers had access to the scientific literature on radium toxicity while continuing to market radioactive products as health promoting. Thorium, like radium, is an alpha-emitting radioactive element that is incorporated into bone tissue when ingested, where it irradiates surrounding tissue at close range over the long half-life of the isotope. Regular ingestion of thorium-containing toothpaste by people who were instructed to use it daily would have produced ongoing bone dose from incorporated material, with cancer risk increasing with duration and frequency of use. Story 34, the makers of toxic shock causing tampons blamed women's personal hygiene. The toxic shock syndrome outbreak of the late 1970s and early 1980s, associated with the use of highly absorbent synthetic tampon materials introduced during that period, is one of the clearer documented cases of pharmaceutical and consumer product companies using victim blaming as a public communication strategy to deflect from a product safety problem they had evidence of. Toxic shock syndrome is caused by toxin-producing strains of Staphylococcus aureus bacteria, and the specific connection to tampons involves the material composition and absorbency of ultra-high absorbency tampons introduced in the late 1970s. The synthetic materials used in products like Rely and certain Playtex tampons created an environment within the vaginal canal that the research subsequently established was unusually conducive to growth of toxin-producing staph strains. The specific fiber composition and high absorbency apparently created conditions that favored rapid bacterial proliferation. The public health response established the tease-tampon connection relatively quickly through epidemiological investigation, and Rely was withdrawn from the market in 1980. The cover-up element documented in internal corporate communications is the prior knowledge window, the period during which manufacturers were receiving clinical reports indicating a TSS tampon association, and managing those reports in ways that prioritized continued sales over rapid public health notification. The public messaging from some manufacturers during the outbreak period included messaging emphasizing the importance of personal hygiene and TIS prevention, a framing that attributed the disease risk to individual user behavior rather than to product composition, in a manner that internal evidence suggested the companies knew was incomplete at best.